Hello there. I wanted to make a little video about the subject of shadow, which I think it's a subject which tends to get quite, on the one hand, it gets sort of demonized, on the other hand, it gets fetishized, but neither really does it justice somehow. We experience shadow as in many ways the things that we have problems with and the places where we kind of fail in life in many ways. Because it's an experience of limitation and the limitations of being in form and the limitations of being in incarnation, I think, most essentially. But it is a quality which is essential to our own individuality and our own being. We wouldn't be here without shadow. We wouldn't be who we are without shadow. So it's a whole subject in itself. Now, that doesn't mean that one acquiesces in shadow without it being transformed, but it does mean that shadow, well, it will be madness to try and avoid shadow, for instance, because that's avoiding the whole point of your being here in a sense. It has so much to do with how and why we incarnate, I believe. So those are all things to consider when thinking about shadow. I think there have been two major approaches to dealing with shadow in a kind of what you might call a sort of mystical sense or spiritual sense. One is to kind of like fight it and get above it and, in a sense, avoid it at all costs, which is, that's an understandable strategy, given that it's connected with great suffering, which it certainly is. If you go into shadow, you will find suffering, but you will also find wisdom ultimately. But there's no doubt that the suffering is very, very real, and that the risks are real. The other approach has been to, in a sense, intelligently embrace shadow, put it that way, so that you go into your reason for being here without actually succumbing to unconsciousness, I guess is what you would put. I've not really got a good handle on how to express this. But to find what it is that you're here for, in a sense, because you really do need to go into shadow to find what you're here for, rather than to simply get through it, if you see what I mean. So that second way is to actually sort of like embrace it in a way and to intelligently engage with it. And that's what in the Hindu traditions they basically call the left and the right hand path, which unfortunately the modern left hand path I think has no real handle on at all. It doesn't seem, anyway, most of it. But it's another question. I mean, shadow is concerned with materiality in a sense. It's concerned with the material. It's concerned with incarnation, manifestation, being here. And it's the way that we deal with that that generates what we normally think of as shadow, which is all the things that we come across. The problems we have with it. But one yet has to really understand that it is very much part of the mechanism of incarnation. It's part of the mechanism of manifestation. And so it is part of what we, in a sense, assent to in being here. And we have to come to terms with it. And we have to then, in a sense, regenerate our experience of it. And understand it without succumbing to the negativity of that we as human beings make of these things. So it's a very big work. It's a very profound work, I think, and it is I think a very deeply esoteric work. But it's one which all people face essentially. and they face it in their everyday lives in all sorts of ways, in coming to terms with their limitations, in coming to terms with their problems, in coming to terms with their fallibility, and their failure, really. These are things which people constantly have to come to terms with, and then on top of that they find their way, because there's, I mean, Gurdjieff once said, the road to success is built over the bodies of your failures. It's basically, you have to go through all of those failures. You have to go through all of those confrontations with just how fallible and failed you are and how limited you are. You have to go through all of these deep failures and meet a kind of death in them, because the bodies that remain from those deaths are your road, in a sense, that you can walk down to something else. But there's no shortcut. There is no shortcut. Anyway, that's probably about as much as I've got to say about it. I mean, there's other things that come into it. We've been doing a lot of interesting discussions about the elements and elemental archetypes, and that's again something to go into. My dog is groaning for some reason, and that's another thing to go into. I think you see there as well that shadow is also associated in part with the element of earth, because it's the concretization of things, and it's physical manifestation. Also clearly connected with Saturn, and it's in some ways, and is also a key to our understanding of the underworld and our relationship to the underworld. Anyway, I seem to be being called away by the little master, so I will stop it here. Okay, now my dog is settled. There's one other thing with respect to the two ways, the right and the left. I think it's important to understand, from what I understand, it's important to understand that the two ways ultimately come down to the same thing and lead to the same place. People tend to judge the right-hand path on the merits of exoteric religion, and that's not truthfully entirely fair, because when it comes down to it, although I can't fit into that, it's too monotheistic, but in practice, spiritual processes follow a form, and the form is inherent in human beings and in the universe and in the world and in reality. It is inherent. So the sort of processes that unfold, in fact, end up being quite similar. It's just that the understandings of them are somewhat different. In the approach to them is somewhat different. But it was always very clear, if you read anything from sort of, even superficially from Indian Tantra, that the right and the left-hand path were meant to lead to the same goal, but they took different routes and different methods. So one tried to purify and be beyond, those things which are seen to be sinful or vicious, and to engage in virtue, etc., etc. And the other way was seen to immerse itself and experience those things which were considered to be impure, but to find the road to purity through them. But both involve great purification, both involve enormous amounts of work, both involve purification. They're different approaches, as far as I understand. That makes sense to me. Unfortunately, the modern so-called left-hand path has shut itself up into a little box, it seems, due to its antipathy towards that which is not it. It's funny, really. But anyway, that's just the only thing I wanted to add. That the two ways are in fact not two ways, really. But it's just important to understand the place of shadow, and that it is a sacred thing. So that's all I could add for that. Okay, bye bye.